Thank you, Ralph. I'm going to talk this morning on the history of pathology at the Johns Hopkins Hospital. And I have no disclosures. These are my objectives. I have no disclosures. And I have to tell you that it's an honor for me to be able to give you this talk. I love history, but more, I love the Johns Hopkins Hospital and the Department of Pathology. I think we have the greatest pathology department in the world. I have thought that since I got here. And in thinking that, in deference to my privilege of being able to work here, I wanted to understand the history of Hopkins Hospital and Hopkins Pathology. And I put this talk together and gave it for the first time 11 years ago, in 2007. And I was residency director at the time, and I put the talk together really to give it to the residents because I wanted you all to know about the history of our department. And so since then, not a whole lot has changed, but you'll see. And I normally I have started this talk with a little quiz, and I'm going to do that today. So we're going to take a little quiz and maybe 5 questions. And I'd like you to tell me, who is this guy? This is William Welch. Question number 1. Question number 2, who is this guy? And I think you'll see it. The theme of this talk is to show you how far our department has come in the last 100 years. Who is this guy? Who is this guy? This guy in the middle and the 2 women beside him? Heppy, Sharon Weiss to our right, Risa Mann to our left. Joe Eggleston, founder of the Eggleston Lecture. How about this guy? Those of you interested in GYN pathology or GYN pathologist, this is Emil Novak, the founder or the original great GYN pathologist. Not quite the original, we'll see. This is an important picture for me because you'll see here, this is the secretarial pool back in about 1963. And this person right here that's Mabel Smith. This is Mary Lakin, who's still around and who we owe our whole existence to Mary Lakin because she runs the IT department, and without her we would have nothing. And she's still on board working hard. Who is this? This is Bill Shelley. What is the significance of this piece of art? We'll tell you how this got to be. It's very important. And who is this? This is Johns Hopkins. So you'll talk to somebody from the outside, and they'll refer to someone as John Hopkins. I work at Johns Hopkins Hospital. But it's actually plural, Johns Hopkins. And how did it get that way? Well, in about 1700, 2 prominent Quaker families got married or connected. Margaret Johns married Gerald Hopkins, and they named their first son after the 2 surnames, Johns Hopkins. And our current Johns Hopkins, the one in the picture, is the grandson of the original Johns Hopkins. That's how we got to have Johns Hopkins. And Johns Hopkins was a wealthy Quaker industrialist in Baltimore. He ran banks and he ran railroads and he had a lot of money. And when he died in 1873, he left $7 million to found a university and a hospital with a medical school attached. So in 1876, he founded Johns Hopkins University. And the first president was a man named Daniel Coit Gilman, still a prominent name in Baltimore. In 1889, the hospital was founded and built, and in 1893, the medical school was formed. Now, Hopkins is a newcomer to the field compared to other institutions. Harvard is the first university in America, founded in 1636. The Pennsylvania Hospital, founded by Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia, is the first hospital in this country, and that was 1751. And the first medical school in the country was the University of Pennsylvania, founded before the Revolutionary War in 1765. And even the University of Maryland Hospital or medical school is a good bit older than we are, formed in 1807. So Hopkins is a fairly recent comer to the world of education. So when Gilman took over and realized he had to build a medical school, he looked around and found this man, John Shaw Billings, who was a very well-known military surgeon, to hire him to form the hospital, to build the building, to hire the staff, and Billings was the key point, the center of building Johns Hopkins institution. So Billings looked around. He had in mind who he was going to hire to be the first doctors at Hopkins, and the first one he went to was this man, William Welch. And Welch was in Germany at the time, working in several laboratories, Conheim's lab for one. And in 1876, he was approached by Billings and said, please come to Baltimore. We want you to lead up and head up a brand new hospital and medical school that we're about to build. And he managed to convince Welch to come to Baltimore. Now, Welch had an interesting history. He went to Yale to college, Columbia Pianista Medical School. He went to Europe then, and then he came to New York City, and what caught Billings' attention was that Welch set up a laboratory of pathology in New York at Bellevue Hospital, which was really the first pathology laboratory in the country. And that's what made him really special. So Billings invited Welch to Baltimore because of that. Now, we'll see other things that Welch did. He was the first dean of the medical school. He was the first pathology chairman. He quit being pathology chairman in 1917 and the dean, and he founded the School of Public Health. He also founded the Institute of the History of Medicine, which he modeled after some institutes in Germany. And then he also built the Welch Library. So an amazing guy what he did. And so when he came, this is a painting documenting the very first signing of the deal. This is Gilman here, Billings, this is Welch, and they're making a deal with the trustees of the university to do the founding of the first medical school. And this is a photograph of Gilman in the middle, this is Billings, and this is Welch, and this is at the time of the founding of the medical school. So things went on, and by the time Welch had been around for many years, he was the most famous doctor in America. I find that pretty cool that a pathologist should be the most famous doctor in America. He was known by everyone as the pillar of medical science, so that when he had his 80th birthday, he celebrated it with President Hoover, I can never say that right, Herbert Hoover, on his 80th birthday. He was the equivalent at the time that Rudolf Virchow was in Berlin about 30 years earlier. And Welch was a great admirer of Virchow. And so Welch was sort of like the American equivalent, being a statuary figure in medicine in general. He was a remarkable man. Here he is in his office at about the same time. He's 80 years old at the time. He looks pretty good for age 80. I want you to look at this picture right here. You will see this in a minute. And here's a picture of, you know who this is? This is William Osler. And Osler, I find it quite touching, actually, that and Osler was his colleague. I find it quite touching that, that he had a picture on his wall of a colleague of his. I mean, that tells me something. I mean, I can see your wife or your kids or something, but a colleague. So I was thinking very seriously of putting a picture of Ashley on my wall. So he was to die 3 years later of prostate cancer, but he left a legacy because he's one of two pathologists ever to make the cover of Time magazine in 1930 on his 80th birthday. One other pathologist did. Does anybody know who that was? James Ewing, the year after, cancer man. Also, you could do a whole hour or two lecture on Ewing and his life and career. As a matter of fact, everybody that we're going to meet this morning, you could do a whole book on. They're all fascinating characters. So I've sort of abstracted what I found interesting about everybody. So when Welch was signed the deed, they didn't have any buildings for him. So he and his buddy Councilman went to work at the Bayview Asylum. It was called the Bayview Asylum at that time. It still is an asylum, if you ask me. And they worked over there until this building could be built. And this is the very first building on the Hopkins Medical Campus that's at the corner, or was at the corner, of Wolf and Monument Street. This is the original building, that Welsh built, and his laboratory. So the pathology lab was the first building in Hopkins. Interestingly, Bayview Asylum changed its name to the Baltimore City Hospital, and then it became the Francis Scott Key Hospital because it overlooks the Key Bridge and the Fort McHenry and everything. And then it went back to Bayview Hospital. So this is where everything took place in the laboratory in 1886. And this is the groundbreaking of the building of the hospital. This street that you see down here in the bottom is Broadway. And this is the campus that the medical school was going to be built on. And this is what it looked like when it opened in 1889. And you go out in front, and I encourage you guys to do that. Go out in front and look at the building from the front. It looks very much the same as it did now. Of course, the Weinberg building is far off in the distance, and all the stuff behind it. But this was the male ward, and the female ward is over on the other side. Interestingly, the medical school came a couple years later because they ran out of money. The stock market of the B&O Railroad stopped paying dividends, and they couldn't finish the medical school. So they had to reach out to the Baltimore City community. And a family, the Garrett family, Mary Elizabeth Garrett, donated. She got together with some of her very wealthy friends in Baltimore. She got together and donated $300,000 of her own money, but she managed to scrape up another couple $100,000 to give to the hospital to be able to finish the medical school. And she actually made 3 stipulations when she gave the money. Number one is that the admissions requirement to the medical school were very stringent. You had to have Greek and Latin, and as a matter of fact, Osler commented years later that he wouldn't have gotten into the medical school if using the standards dictated by Mary Elizabeth Garrett. Number 2, she demanded that a nursing school be built, and number 3, she demanded that women be admitted to medical school. That was somewhat of an unheard of, and most of the people balked at that, including Welch himself, felt a little uncomfortable talking things with women, but eventually relented, and that was the deal. Women would be admitted to medical school. And keep in mind that women were not allowed into a lot of medical schools, and in fact, Harvard Medical School did not admit women until after World War II. So Hopkins was very innovative. Now, this is a painting by John Singer Sargent. We're going to see another, and Sargent was an American painter, the foremost portrait painter of his day. He was living in London at the time and painted all the London royalty and establishment. But Mary Elizabeth Garrett needed more money, so she reached out to women, prominent women all over the country, and she found Mrs. Alexander Graham Bell, Mrs. J. Pierpont Morgan, Miss Clara Barton, and she found several other really prominent women, including this woman, Elizabeth Blackwell. You know the significance of Elizabeth Blackwell? Elizabeth Blackwell was the first woman ever to graduate from medical school in the United States, and she did in 1849. And it's a very interesting story about her. It's not part of our story, but it's interesting that this first woman doctor participated in the founding of Hopkins. She went to the Geneva Medical College, which was part of Hobart at the time, later taken over by Syracuse University, and then finally by SUNY Upstate. And Mary Elizabeth Blackwell was the first woman, and she and her sister, who was the third woman to graduate from medical school ever in this country, formed the Hospital for Women and Children in Manhattan. Interestingly, when she was admitted, they voted on her. The 150 males in the class voted on her, and they admitted her they voted her in as a joke. And she graduated at the top of her class after only 3 years of medical school. So she wasn't a joke. So at any rate, Welsh is now on board, and he hires his original nucleus of great doctors, the original 4, the great 4 in this painting by Sargent, done in London in 1906. They went to London for this painting, and they're in Sargent's studio, and you can see Welch on the left. That's Halstead, that's Osler, and that's Kelly. These are the great 4 doctors of Johns Hopkins Hospital. And if you Google the 4 doctors, this is the painting you're going to get. So, because Hopkins was found by a pathologist, the laboratory was seen as the foundation of medical practice. all medicine would be based on pathology, and pathology was going to be based on science. And so I like the idea, which I wanted to instill in the residents, is that what was taught me by my mentor, Dr. Bhagavan, is that any clinical department is only as good as the pathologist who supports that department. And Hopkins embodies that tradition. We believe that pathology is the foundation of clinical care, and we should participate in the clinical care of our patients. We're not off in some laboratory somewhere in the dark basement. We are actively involved in medicine and medical care, and that's what Welch taught us. And the laboratory still is today, I believe, the soul of this hospital at Johns Hopkins. And Hopkins would be a teaching hospital, and that's an amazing thing too, because most hospitals at the time, particularly in Europe, they didn't want medical students. They thought they were there just to care for sick people, and they didn't want to bother with teaching. Harvard was one of them. University of Pennsylvania was one of them, where medical students were not allowed in the major hospitals. They got their clinical care on the streets, as it were. But Hopkins was going to be a hospital that took in medical students and taught them on site with the sick patients. And in 1889, you can see this is the very first publication that Hopkins Hospital did. And this is a very important publication, the Hopkins Hospital Bulletin. And papers, very famous papers were published in this, and I have referenced papers from this journal a number of times. You can see it was 1889. It cost 15 cents at the time. And here it is again, 15 cents. This is volume 1, number 1. And you can read in it, the second paragraph, the instruction in pathology is under the charge of W.H. Welch and W.T. Councilman. Councilman, of course, was around for a while, and then he left and went to Harvard. That's the same councilman as councilman bodies. So here's the very first graduating class. Welch is now in the middle. He's the dean of medicine, and he is sitting proudly with his first class. Everybody on this picture went on to very famous careers. This is an important guy right here. Do we know who this is? This is William McCallum. And McCallum would be the next department chairman in pathology. They all went on, and this particular guy here, he went on to an illustrious career in orthopedic surgery. But there's one person who's missing from this picture. Do you know who that is? The person who didn't make it in this picture is a woman by the name of Mary Packard. Hopkins' original class had 3 women in it. One of them dropped out to marry her anatomy teacher, Frank Mall. The other took a different slant and went up to Boston to be a Christian Scientist with Mary Baker Eddy. And Mary Packard stayed on. And she graduated with this class. It's cute to read the New York Times little clip about her, is that she accepted her diploma with appropriate modesty. So this is McCallum here, and it doesn't take long for McCallum to rise to fame. Even as a medical student, he elucidated one of the growth cycle of the malaria parasite. I mean, he was already a very creative researcher. And here he is again, and this is a higher power picture of this young boy almost. I look at these kids, and they look like children to me by now. And this is McCallum, this is Welch, and this is sort of the first nucleus of the Department of Pathology in 1906. And McCallum is over here in the corner. And this is the Department of Pathology. This guy here is George Whipple of Whipple's disease. And he subsequently moved to California, and he's not the Whipple, of course, that did the Whipple operation. That was a different Whipple. But Whipple left after a while, and McCallum was in charge, and it didn't take long for him to become in charge. However, there was a little waylay because he went up to Columbia after that picture was taken, and he was chairman up there for a number of years. And while he was at Columbia, he wrote his major textbook of pathology. And this is the equivalent of Robbins' textbook for many of us. This was the founding textbook in pathology. And this one is 1916. He wrote it when he was at Columbia, and it went through many, many editions. As a matter of fact, my father, who was in dental school in 1940, had this McCallum's textbook of pathology, and it stayed around our house for a number of years, long before I knew what pathology was. I would look through it. And this is a drawing from it. This is a drawing where many of the images in the microscope were captured not by a photograph, although they could do it, but a camera lucida drawing where you'd shine the beam from the light on a piece of paper and trace around it. Same is true with this drawing of osteitis deformans, or of arthritis deformans of the hip, which is osteoarthritis, basically. These are drawings from his textbook. So McCallum was known everywhere through his textbook. And he came back to the department to be chairman in 1917 when Welsh stepped out to be the public health director. And he became chairman, and he was chairman for a long time, until 27 years, until 1944. That's a long time to be a chairman, 27 years. He did a lot of things in pathology. He figured out what happened when you did a pancreatic duct ligation. He elucidated changes in hyperparathyroidism, the McCallum's patch in the heart, which is secondary to the blood flow due to carcinoid tumors, and he showed that the lymphatic system in our body was closed. So he did a lot of really great research. He didn't get out of the hospital very much, I have to say. Here he is teaching in the autopsy room, and here he is as an older guy. He looks sad, and look at his quote up at the top. Jack Yardley told me this quote: "A successful pathologist is either single or unhappily married." He did have a girlfriend, however. Apparently, Jack Yardley told me this also, is that he was fascinated with this woman, who was a movie actress. Anybody who know this is? This is Gloria Swanson. And so for some reason, he had some long-standing on-again, off-again thing with Gloria Swanson, who, by the way, had 7 husbands herself, so she probably didn't have a whole lot of time for McCallum, but at any rate, it's in the legend. So that building at the corner of, that 2-story building was torn down, and this is what McCallum built. This is the building of pathology at the time. This is still, you're looking across the street at the building as if you're standing on Wolf Street, looking across to the pathology building. And this is now as if you were standing on the corner of the Welch Library, looking at the corner. Right there is the corner of Wolf and Monument Street. You can see the old cars. It's about 1920. The dome is in the back. And here is one of the laboratories where the residents would sit and do pathology. And you can see the microscopes are over on the right, and they have to be by the sunlight because the way you got light was from a mirror reflecting on the sun. And this is the autopsy room. It has a skylight. It has this thing right here is a dictaphone. This is the autopsy table, and these are the galleries. Now, interestingly, the operating rooms at Hopkins, up until I came in 1976, all had galleries. The anatomy rooms had galleries. The autopsy rooms had galleries. Why was this? It was because part of the tradition of these practices, surgery, autopsies, anatomy dissection, was the whole idea that people would come and watch you perform. It was all about theater. And they all had galleries, so people would come and they would watch. And the great surgeons were showmen, and the great dissectors were showmen, and they tried to impress the public that were watching them. This is all theater. And that's where they sat. And these, or stood actually, watching the autopsies during that time. So now we're looking at this very corner we looked at before. Things are a little different, and right here I want you to notice that there's some pillars. And when you look today, or actually this is 10 years ago when I took this, the pillars are still there. My office at that time was on the 3rd floor. Surgical pathology was up on the 7th floor. And fortunately, they chose not to tear this building down when they did all the big renovations. And I'm glad about that because this is the heart and soul of where pathology was. And I'm quite sure in the old elevator there, the shades and spirits of the greats are still living around in this particular area there. So this is now 1921. There's McCallum. And I want you to notice this guy right here. This is Arnold Rich. And Arnold Rich would be the 3rd chairman of pathology up until about 1960. He died in 68, but I think he was chairman until about 63, we'll see. And here he is, probably 20 years, in 1920 or so. He's now at the right hand of McCallum. And he would be under McCallum for 20 more years before he became department chairman. I want to point your attention to this woman right here. Do anybody know who that is? Any of the cytopathology people know who this is? This is Ella Oppenheimer. And the reason I mention that, and I'll tell you why you should know that. Ellen Oppenheimer, you probably remember Ella. She was in the department, and she was a fabulous woman. She was a Baltimore woman either was from the Hutzler family or the Hochschild family. And she went to Goucher to college, Hopkins to medical school. She joined the Hopkins faculty and was on the staff for 38 years. And she was a remarkable woman, and she did several things. Here she is, an older woman in her office. And this, well, before I tell you this, what she was known for is that she was a pediatric pathologist mainly. And she was charged by Rich that I want you to now make a diagnostic index of all the diseases that you see so that we can retrieve them at a later date. So she started that whole process of indexing autopsy diagnoses and indexing surgical path diagnoses. So that at the end of every day, when you're signing out, you would go to this list and by hand write out in a little book what you saw that day in an order organized according to organ systems. And this, at the end of the year, that book would be published, and this is what you got, a book like this. This is from 1949, this book. I would encourage you guys to look at it. It's an incredible thing where it's typewritten and I go into bones and I look up bone tumors and I see diagnoses. I have no idea what they're talking about. But at any rate, this is how it all began. And this was being done when I had my first appointment at Hopkins in 1976. They were still looking in this book to get cases of whatever you wanted to write up about. That was all due to Ella Oppenheimer. This was the library, the pathology library, which is up where it is today, but on the other side, the far side of it, is where Cytopath is. So they divided this building in two. They made a door right here that takes you into the Meyer building. And this is before they made the door. They swung this whole fireplace toward us. Cytopath was over here, and the library is now the other half, the near half, the proximal half in this picture. Go into that library, and you can see the portrait of Ella Oppenheimer. It's still hanging up there. A great lady in our department. And the sad part is, with all her accomplishments and her being in the department for 38 years, she was never promoted to full professor. So now we're 1942, 41. This is just before McCallum decided to step down, and Rich is at his side. I was always very curious about this woman right here. She looks like she's got some secret. I don't know who that is. But at any rate, this is now what happens when McCallum goes. McCallum is still on board, but he's going to go. And now, who's the chairman of the department? Bernard Arnold Rich. There's, of course, Ella Oppenheimer to his right, a couple people. And he's now chairman of the department for 14 years, until 1958. Now, Rich was an interesting guy. He was a very reactionary guy. He didn't want anybody telling him what to do. Here he is with a guy named Hammond, who was a pulmonologist. And together, you know what syndrome they found? The Hammond-Rich syndrome. Anybody know what that is? We don't call it that anymore. We call it acute alveolar damage followed by interstitial fibrosis. But that was invented by Hammond and Rich. And here's Hammond. There's Rich again at the dissecting bench. And here's the article. In the Bulletin of Johns Hopkins Medicine, 1944, acute diffuse interstitial lung disease. And when I was in pathology, it was called the Hammond-Rich syndrome. Rich was also a very brilliant researcher. He described serum sickness, pathology of jaundice, pathology of tuberculosis, interstitial lung disease. And here are some weird features about him. Number one, he hated cytopathology. He thought it was absurd that you could make a diagnosis from one cell. Two, he forbade anybody in the department to look for external funding. He hated that. He would not allow you to. You know who the first guy who get a grant was? Do you know, Ralph? It was Yardley. He was the first guy to get a grant. And, however, Rich was a great teacher. I should tell you that John Frost came on board about a little in Rich's term, and he was a very well-known cytopathologist, and Rich hated him. Rich would not even let him join the pathology department. He had to find appointment in some other department. When I first came to Baldwin, I took Frost's course in cytopathology, and he was the soul of cytopathology for many, many years, right, Inner? He was a remarkable teacher. He gave a great course, which people came from all over the world to take the cytopath course. This is Rich's daughter. Rich's daughter was Adrienne Rich, a very famous poet who wrote poetry and wrote this book of Woman Born. She was a very feminist writer, and you can read in her work that she didn't like her father too much. But, you know, Rich was a very reactionary guy. So it was about 1936 when the boards of pathology were formed. You know, the boards of pathology, all the medical boards were formed in the 30s, where you became officially a pathologist or officially a gynecologist. And when the board people came to examine Hopkins' pathology program, Rich would not let him in the building. His comment was, "How can anybody examine me?" So actually what happened that time is that the residents and some of the other staff sneaked out and took the guy out to lunch so that they wouldn't be in trouble, and they told him what was going on in the department. The other thing about Rich is that, interesting thing I think, is he was really an outstanding violist. And his wife was a concert pianist. And he would make the residents come over to his house once every Friday night to listen to him play the viola. I have never done that to you guys to play when I play the cello. So here we are in 1956. We see Rich, we see Ella Oppenheimer, and there's the first guy who appears. Anybody know who this guy is? This is Jack Yardley. Also, Jack Yardley was probably the first pathologist to be chief of surgical pathology. We knew him well. He was a wonderful man. He was dean in the medical school, and he was the chairman, we'll see, of the department. Here's John Yardley at that time. He's a young kid, so to speak. And at that time, after Rich was done, in about 1958, they hired a new pathologist. Rich retired. He still hung around for 3 years. Mabel, at this time, was already working for Bennett, but Rich would come around and visit. The problem with Ivan Bennett is that Ivan Bennett was not a pathologist. He was an internal medicine doctor, and people hated that, and Rich hated that. Why would you not have a pathologist as department chairman in pathology? The truth is, you know, there are pathology departments today where the chairman is not a pathologist, that maybe in some other specialty that happen to be, or not even a physician sometimes, a PhD, that happen to be really good researchers or really good organizers or good leaders, so they are made department chairman. Like I think of Charlie Cummings, who was an otolaryngologist, but he was chairman of dermatology, he was chairman of orthopedic surgery. They moved him around as an interim chairman because he was really a good organizer and he knew how to manage people. Well, Ivan Bennett was that way. He was a very creative guy, an innovator, and he came in as a perfect timing because Rich was very reactionary and didn't want to change at all. And Bennett came and he changed everything. However, this picture, one of the pathologists at the time was so enraged that a non-pathologist would be chairman. I think it was a guy named Subner, who went to the special stains room and he took all the special stains and enraged threw them all over the wall. And they looked like a Jackson Pollock painting. And that wall stayed like that for a good number of years. And when Rich would come in and see it, I mean, he didn't really understand that that painting was in honor of him. So here's Bennett in the middle. He was chairman for a while. This is Ella Oppenheimer, who's still on board. And it's still a wonderful group of people. I want to show you somebody else. This guy is, where is he? He's right, where is he? Well, I can't.
Back row, kind of middle left.
There he is. This guy right there. Who's that? That's John Boitnott as a kid. So he was on board about 1961. Now here's Bennett. Bennett actually did know a good bit of pathology, and he's in the dissecting room. And that behind him is Grover Hutchins, who used to run our autopsy service for most of, in my remembrance. And here's the great team of secretaries. We have Mabel Smith in the middle there and Mary Lakin. Those are the two. This is Mary. And this is Mabel. And here's Mabel in 1962 or 61. Sitting at her desk. She served 6 department chairmen. She sat at her desk and hardly moved and just churned out the work. I mean, she's a remarkable woman. And there's, she comes to our awards ceremony. She was there the last time we had it. Now, interestingly, one of the things that Bennett did was to combine the laboratories in the hospital. The laboratories like chemistry and microbiology and blood banking, they were scattered in many departments everywhere in the hospital. And Bennett said, we're going to make one department, and we're going to call it the Department of Laboratory Medicine. And all the labs were brought under one roof. And it was called the Division of Laboratory Medicine. And in Europe, that's still a separate specialty, laboratory medicine, as opposed to morbid anatomy, which is pathology anatomy, gross anatomic pathology. So laboratory medicine stayed its own department. It was under the head of a guy named Rex Kahn and then a guy named Rock, and they ran laboratory medicine. And U.S. residents would have to separately apply for a program and training in laboratory medicine. You did 2 years in laboratory medicine and then 2 years in anatomic pathology. Because Ivan Bennett was not a pathologist, he hired this guy, Walter Sheldon, to sort of run the pathology aspects of the department. And he was a really outstanding surgical pathologist for a long time. About this time in 1966, this man came around. You know who this is? This is Robert Heptonstall, and he was the 5th chairman of pathology. He was from England. Very colorful career. He was a colorful guy. He's still alive. Ralph goes and visits him every once in a while. He must be 90-something by now.
98.
Is he 98? Man. He worked in Alexander Fleming's lab in England. After the war, they would parachute him in into the jungle to rescue the sick people that were stuck in the jungle after the war was over. Really an interesting guy. And here he is. He was brought from England, and he was sort of working in the Department of Pathology when President Johnson invited Bennett to go work for him in the government. And the plan was that Heptonstall would take over as department chairman for interim, and then when Bennett came back, he would resume, but Bennett never came back. He eventually became the dean at NYU, Bennett. And Heptonstall was left to be department chairman, and he was the department chairman when I got here, and he was the department chairman for a good number of years. And here he is with his team of residents. There's Heppy, we call him Heppy. Sharon Weiss is here. Risa Mann is here. Risa was my predecessor as residency director and an institution in this department. On the far left is Jim Egan, who runs the pathology at St. Joseph Hospital. Sina Eisner is in the back row. She's a bone pathologist in New Jersey. Stan Hamilton is in that picture somewhere. I think he must be in the back right.
Big bow tie.
Big bow tie, yeah. So this was and here's the staff about that time. That's the closer up. Here's the staff with Heppy in the middle. This is Rock on the left, Yardley, Boitnott, Eggleston, and John Frost. Frost by this time was now well accepted in the pathology department. Bennett brought him into the fold. The woman in the back row, the dark hair, is Kate Rothko, who is Mark Rothko, the artist's daughter. She's still in practice. The guy in the upper right-hand corner is Tom Bauer, who is a good friend of mine, who's a well-known bone pathologist that I work with. So these guys go back in my memory pretty well. And Heppy was a renal pathologist, and he was a founding father of renal pathology. He wrote this book, The Pathology of the Kidney. It went through many, many editions. Matter of fact, even at 98, I bet he's working on his 40th edition. He still works on it. And what this accomplished was really that he sort of trained us to look at kidney through tiny biopsies. Used to get kidneys at autopsies or surgical resections. But now this pathology was based on the renal biopsy. And that was Heppy's big thing, looking at renal biopsies of kidneys. And then Heppy retired. And these two guys took over for 4 years as department chairman. Jack Yardley, John Boitman. By the way, all these pictures are up in the administrative office or either in the hallway or in Ralph's office. I asked Yardley once how long he had been department chairman with Boitnott, and he said, as long as the Civil War. He never did clarify for me whether he was the North or the South. But at any rate, they did a fabulous job holding things together. And they were recruiting all this time, and they did recruit another stellar guy. Well, before we go on to that, I want to show you something else. Here's our great four. This guy right here, Halstead. Now, Halstead was kind of an abrasive guy, and John Singer Sargent didn't like him. So he put him in the back of the picture, hoping that he would fade over the years. But you can always retouch up a painting. But Halstead was in the lab. All these guys, by the way, were very attuned to pathology. Osler did many autopsies himself. He wrote papers on his autopsies. Halstead was in the lab for many years. Kelly was in the lab for many years, all doing pathology. So all these clinicians have a strong pathology foundation. But Halstead had a number two man in his department. And the number two man of Halstead was this guy, Joe Bloodgood. He was the original founder of surgical pathology. Because in those days, in the early 20s and 30s, the idea of surgical pathology was done by surgeons. Surgeons figured out they better figure out what they're operating on. So they did surgical pathology. And the great surgical pathologists were surgeons. That included Arthur Purdy Stout, Raphael Lattice, all these original guys, and Bloodgood. He was a great surgeon, and this was the day when it doesn't matter what organ you operated on. They were not yet certified in one specialty or another. He promoted the whole concept of a biopsy. Imagine that. Part of our daily life. But up until then, nobody thought it would be a good idea to have an idea what it was before you chopped it out. So he thought, let's biopsy something first. And then he also, although this is controversial because a lot of departments claim it, he also was one of the first people to use the frozen section. And he wrote on the breast. This is one of the original articles, 1908, on the differential diagnosis of disorders of the breast. Here he wrote on biopsy of breast region, 1933. And I am very interested in Bloodgood historically because of his involvement in bone pathology. He was a bone tumor surgeon as well. And he wrote a book on one of the first papers on giant cell tumors of bone. And this is a picture from one of his paintings, from one of his articles. And this is a giant cell tumor of the distal radius. You can read that the painting was by Harvey Cushing. It's one of Halstead's cases, but it was in Bloodgood's paper. Interestingly, a painting by Harvey Cushing, the great neurosurgeon, was also a fabulous painter. He painted wonderful things. And he's also a great writer, too, Cushing. He was the first physician to ever win a Pulitzer Prize for his biography of Osler. Again, here's a colleague writing a biography of a colleague. So, Ralph, I'm going to write your biography. So this is Bloodgood's paper, and Bloodgood collected hundreds of bone tumors. And the guy who was on site at the time was a guy named Geschichter. And Geschichter then migrated to New York City. Here he is. He's at somewhere up in Georgetown, and he was up in New York. These are guys that they left Hopkins, and they stole all of Bloodgood's cases with them. So this book on tumors of bone is based on all the Hopkins cases, and yet Hopkins gets no credit for that. Okay, so let's look at 1958. I want you to see this guy. You know who this guy is? Here's Rich, Ella Oppenheimer, this guy. This is the chief of surgical pathology for 10 years. This is Bill Shelley, fabulous pathologist. He ran surgical pathology. He left in 1970, and sadly, he went to somewhere south North Carolina, I think, and sadly in 1974, he was killed in a plane accident. And the following month, his son was killed in a car accident. So we started the Shelley Lecture in 1977, and we must keep in mind that the Shelley Lecture is devoted to both Bill Shelley and his son, because Shelley, because of his great commitment to surgical pathology at Johns Hopkins. Look at that microscope. He was followed by Joe Eggleston and another guy, Darrell Carter. Darrell Carter and Joe ran surgical pathology for a while, and Darrell Carter left to go to, the last time I gave this talk, Darrell was in the audience somewhere, and I loved having him around. He was a great pulmonary pathologist, and he and Joe wrote the fascicle on tumors of the lung at the time. And sadly, Joe, paradoxically, got lung cancer. And it was interesting because he survived a long time with it. It was in his mediastinum, and he survived 8, maybe 9 years with lung cancer. And I have many remembrances of sitting in the sophomore medical school lecture hall, watching Joe lecture to the medical students on lung cancer. And I knew that he was suffering from lung cancer while he was doing it. It was very moving for me to see that. So now we go to this guy, Howard Kelly, the father of gynecology at Johns Hopkins Hospital, one of the 4 doctors. Here he is. He was a dynamic guy, amazing man. As an aside, Kelly was one of the first doctors to use radium to treat carcinoma of the GYN tract. He would do radium implants. And they didn't let him do it at Hopkins. So what Kelly did is he left the hospital and he went across town and started his own hospital. The building is still over there near Utah Street, where he had a hospital that just gave women radiation therapy for their GYN cancers.
Ground is still contaminated.
It's probably. Is it really? But of course, in those days, they treated everything with radiation, and this was his protege, Thomas Cullen. And Cullen was a gynecologist, but they didn't have room for Cullen in the clinical department, so he went to work in the laboratory. And he started studying the pathology of GYN diseases. And this is the operating room where Cullen and Kelly worked, and they got their specimens from this operating room. And this is the first book by Cullen, Cancer of the Uterus. I have to be careful because I once had a secretary mistype that as Cancer of the Universe. And not a whole lot far away, but anyway, this is the original story, the original book on cancer of the uterus by Cullen, the father of GYN pathology. And he dedicated to his friends and teachers. This was the frozen section machine that they often used in GYN pathology. It was basically liquid nitrogen that squeezed. The very first story is that Welch was asked to do a frozen section for Halstead, and they used to, in order to make frozen sections in those days, up on the 7th floor of the pathology building, they actually just put this, in the winter, they put the specimen on the windowsill and they let it freeze that way. It would take a long time, needless to say. And with the very first frozen that was supposedly done here, Welch did the frozen, and Halstead was in the operating room, and Halstead was long done with the case by the time the frozen was ready to look at. So it got off to a rocky start, but this is when we could freeze it with liquid, with nitrogen. This is from Cullen's book of the uterus, opened up, kind of a secretory type endometrium there, and this is a picture of a drawing of secretory endometrium from his book. And then Cullen turned everything over to Emil Novak, a GYN gynecologist. And he did pathology. Now keep in mind, like surgeons doing surgical pathology, it was the gynecologist that did gynecologic pathology. Only difference is the gynecologic pathologist stayed discreet and didn't become part of pathology. As a matter of fact, they didn't want to become part. They wanted their own little world. And this is Novak's book on pathology. This is 1940, that book. And he was followed by Donald Woodruff. Now, some of us probably remember Donald Woodruff. I remember him vividly. He was in charge of GYN pathology before Bob Kerman. He ran GYN pathology as a unit. It was part of GYN and not part of pathology. And only by the grace of the GYN pathologist would standard pathology residents be allowed to rotate in GYN pathology. And so then Don Woodruff wrote his book. Edmund Novak was Emil's son, and Don Woodruff, and they wrote. This is the book that I learned my GYN pathology from, the Woodruff's book on GYN pathology. Then we had another, we're almost done here, we had another renaissance when Yardley and Boitnott ended the Civil War because Fred Sanfilippo was hired from Duke. And he was a dynamic young man, and he came and he was in the department for 7 years. And he really did do another renaissance because you can see what he did with the department in 1999. It was a huge department. And he brought with him half of the Duke faculty. He brought with him Mike Borowitz and Barb Crane and Peter Berger and Wink Baldwin and a whole bunch of other people all came up from Duke, and so Hopkins was known at the time as Duke North. But this is the department at the time, and many of us are still around, fortunately, and many of us are sadly not around. But he did a lot of things, and one of the things he did was that he now dissolved laboratory medicine into the pathology department so that it was now part of pathology. And there was no more department of laboratory medicine, it was all pathology, and AP and CP became totally blended at that time. And no longer did you do 2 and 2, but you interspersed AP and CP along with during your 4 years of training. And then one of the people that Sanfilippo brought was Brooks Jackson, who was a world-famous HIV researcher, a wonderful guy. Most of us remember Brooks pretty well. And he went on to be dean at first at Minnesota and now at Iowa. And Sanfilippo, of course, left to be dean at Emory. Don't make any thoughts about leaving. So anyway, that's Brooks. And these are our department chairmen up until Brooks. And then this guy came along. I took that when Ralph was trying to sneak into the residency program. But here he is now, our chairman. We're lucky that he's our chairman. And to show you now how far we've come in 100 years, we now have about 1,500 people in the department, at least 120 faculty, 35 or 36 residents, hundreds of fellows, lots of pathobiology students. This is a huge department. So we were this, and now we're this. This is what we've evolved to, and it's richer, it's more exciting, it's more interesting, and we have lots of history to think about. So that's the end of my talk. Any questions or anything that I can talk more about? Thank you.